systems don't like each other, ironically. So this is a talk, I gave a version of this talk at NeoISF back in January, if anyone was there. My name is Tom. I'm a pen tester. This is a talk about a project I've been running for about the last year, where I've been port scanning North Korea. And we're going to talk a little bit about stuff I found, some of the methodology. There's a tool at the end if anyone wants to have some fun and trigger North Korean incident response and see what happens. You can have fun doing that. It's on GitHub and stuff, so you can pull it down. I'll have a link later in the presentation. So a little bit about myself. My background's in academia. I was actually a college professor like a year ago. I was teaching philosophy at a number of colleges, political theory, stuff like that. Figured out that adjuncting sucks and you work a lot and don't get paid much. And got a job in tech, first doing threat intelligence, and again, now I'm working as a pen tester. I've been interested in tech for a really long time. I got into pen testing and security stuff, first studying cryptography, and then during the Arab Spring, starting to understand the ways that governments were hacking citizens and phones and things like this on the street, ways that people were circumventing that. Got myself a copy of Backtrack and Metasploitable, and the rest is kind of history, and have literally been addicted to it ever since. Again, I transitioned working into InfoSec in the middle of last year, about July. And during this transition, I was presented with a very specific kind of issue, which is this. So I went from a system in my house, which was like running on my laptop. I had like some VMs and maybe some like mocked up firewalls and stuff like that. And it was all really, really simple and pretty straightforward. And all of a sudden I'm like thrust into this situation where there's like tens of thousands of endpoints and layers of firewalls and all these switches and things like this. And I had literally no way to make sense of it. So I started to try and put together an idea of what I was going to do to make sense of all of that. And I developed what has become called, in my house, the project. Right? So the project involved figuring out a way to footprint, monitor, and make sense of very, very large networks using tools I already knew how to use, which at this point were like NMAP and Masscan and stuff like that, and a methodology grounded in differential analysis, meaning a methodology in which I would take results scanned over a long period of time and start to look for differences or anomalies within those, right? So the requirements for the project were that the network had to be sizable, right, but scannable from my home internet connection. So I wasn't going to like scan Switzerland, it would take forever, right? And I wasn't going to like scan Great Britain, it would take forever. And I wasn't going to scan a company because a lot of companies are relatively large. So I needed something I could scan from my like crappy Time Warner home internet connection, right? Next, the network had to present some challenges to scanning, but provide interesting information. So I didn't want it to be super easy. I wasn't going to like scan the NMAP website over and over and over again and just like get results back. I wanted it to be hard because I wanted to learn how to do this more effectively, what countermeasures are being put in place, and start to understand that. Next, I had to care, right? So when you're taking on a project, it really helps if you care what you're doing. And this is something that I actually have some kind of like weird connection to. Like, I'm very interested in what goes on in North Korea because you don't know. No one literally knows. So it's an interesting project. But most importantly, and what kind of made the decision was the owners of the network either had to be cool with it, which most companies aren't really cool if you just like scan their networks all the time. They really, really, really don't like it. And they probably end up contacting your ISP and then you get really angry nastygram letters and stuff. Or if they weren't cool with it, then they had to be in a position where they couldn't do anything about it, right? So that led to one logical conclusion. Scanning North Korea. So the North Korean internet space only has like 1,500 IPs. Right? Externally facing boxes, most of which are like routers and switches and stuff. Some of which are boxes that are exposed kind of behind the DMZ, but most of them are just basic kind of DMZ appliances, right? So they're relatively easy to kind of figure out. A lot of it's Cisco gear, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But it was manageable and interesting and cool, and like, really, what are they gonna do about it, right? So what do we know, right? I'm not the first person to ever have scanned the North Korean internet. Right? There are other people that have done this, including South Korean activists have done this kind of on and off over a period of time. So there is some information out there, right? And so I started from a basic recon perspective, trying to figure out what was going on, right? So first, there's three IP ranges. This like 175 range which are IPs that are directly allocated to North Korea, right? And this is like claimed in BGP lease and everything, right? We have the 210 network, which is allocated by Unicom, which is a Chinese ISP, and all of their routers exist like immediately right on the border, right? And that's more for like business networks and things like that. Then we have the 77 range, which becomes the interesting range. And I'm going to talk a lot about this range. This range is allocated by Satgate, which is a Russian satellite company. The reason Satgate runs this range is they're literally the only company that has a satellite that orbits over North Korea, right? So they allocate the satellite internet, satellite IP space. And they're doing that as a subcontractor for a company called Intelgate, using Intelgate satellites, right? And we'll talk about why that's important later in the presentation. There's also a very large internal intranet. So there's all these pictures that exist if you go on like South Korean activist websites and stuff. There's all these pictures that exist of these posters in libraries in North Korea that have like an IP address, and then it'll just say like the bank. So it's kind of like the internet in 1985. There's like no DNS, right? It's really, really weird. There was a group of Anons at one point that actually did hack through the DMZ and into those websites, which is really interesting. But as far as anyone knows, they're the first ones and last ones that have publicly announced having gotten in there. But the websites are like super rudimentary. They don't really provide much information. There's a couple externally facing websites. North Korea does have a TLD, but they barely use it. So it begins, right? Late August of last year, I started scanning and immediately ran into a series of issues, right? So obviously I didn't want to scan for something that would show up as my IP address, right? For very obvious reasons. So immediately found out that North Korean InfoSec people really don't like Tor. Like they get really, really mad at you, and everything gets blocked like immediately, right? You're not getting anything through. So anytime a Tor node comes up, and I was using proxy chaining to use NMAP, they pretty much shut the scan down like immediately, right? Like all Tor IPs are blacklisted. SYN scans don't really function very well, right? So if you're just running a SYN scan rather than a full connect scan, they just don't really run very well. And that's probably a signature-based kind of countermeasure against scanning, right? So they generally get blocked. And this is, again, probably because of some sort of like rule on a firewall somewhere that actually prevents you from doing like NMAP scans. The other thing, big problem, is there's a lot of really weird port signatures. And we're going to talk about that later, but I was getting like results that NMAP was identifying as like ports open for malware from the 90s. I mean, just like really, really weird stuff that obviously wasn't correct. So there was a lot of like having to really dig in. A lot of the weird port signatures came up around military installations, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. They don't filter TCP scans if you're running it with normal throttling. So if you try and throttle like way, way, way down and skip through the firewall, they recognize that and block it. If you try and throttle it way, way, way up, they recognize it and block it. What's really interesting is they don't block Masscan even when you're blasting them with packets. And that's what I ended up using, and I'll explain why at the end. They do block scripts. So if you're trying to run like NSE scripts, like NMAP NSE scripts, they block them entirely, right? And they just pretty much cut the scan. But they don't blacklist IPs, which is really, really strange. So like cut your scan off, but they don't actually blacklist the IP. So I was like using VPNs and not really bouncing IP addresses, but I had like one IP in Frankfurt, Germany, and like one in Paris or something, and one in Seattle, and I can keep scanning them. But if they don't like it, they just cut the scan off, temporarily blacklist you, but then you go back tomorrow and you can scan them again. It's really strange. And just like graveyard shift, data center personnel here, they miss stuff, right? So like you scan North Korea at 3 o'clock in the morning their time, and you're pretty cool. They just don't wake up and catch it. It's really interesting. If you scan them in the middle of the afternoon, you're a lot more likely to get caught and blocked, right? But if you scan them in the middle of the night their time, you're usually pretty okay. So the process. So I did like a couple of months of tests, right? Lots and lots of tests, like multiple times a day running tests, testing different times of the day of scanning, different tools, different kinds of scripts, different sorts of scans, all this stuff. And I figured out that the best results were the following, like came from the following sort of process. One, scanning in the middle of the night North Korea time, when possible, which falls in the middle of the workday here. So that's not always something that you can really do. But when I had the chance to, I'd scan them in the middle of the day. Two, primarily using VPNs located in Europe, Although I've had recently some success using a VPN that has an IP address in Seattle. But before they were blocking US IPs that were trying to run scans. But VPNs located in Europe seem to get through just fine. Again, running full TCP scans, so like actually making a full TCP handshake-based connection, they tend to not recognize it as a scan, or at least don't recognize it right away. Taking the risk of increased filtering or blocking of the scan by throttling for efficiency. So even though they'll block things when they're throttled, sometimes you can squeeze the scan in before their instant response time kicks in, right before instant response actually kicks on, and actually get through the whole scan before they block you, right? Which was one of the more interesting things I found. So eventually I just started like blasting packets as fast as I possibly could at them, even though it was really, really obvious, because I could scan one of the 3 ranges, like a whole range in like 20 minutes, right? And that was before instant response would kick in. And then being really, really, really comfortable changing process. So one of the things they do is they adapt their network security constantly. I'm sure everyone can imagine why. But they adapt their network security all the time. So when you're doing these kinds of things, you end up changing your process pretty consistently, like once a week or so, right? Just to kind of switch it up and like keep them guessing about what you're going to do next. So some of the more boring results. So this is what like common results would generally look like, right? You would see on the, in DMZ appliances, you'd see like port 80 open, right? You'd see stuff like this. Port 81, they had their SSH was port 1984, which I thought was funny. They have RPC open on everything, and this is like totally standardized, right? They don't have different ports open on their stuff. Like all of their ports for like a whole IP range will have exactly the same ports open, which is really interesting. It's super, super, super regularized. I also found things like Macs and iPhones just exposed to the internet from the inside of North Korea, which was really strange. Now, if you know anything about the North Korean kind of ruling class, they really like iPhones and they really like Macs. And all of these IP ranges were being able to be geolocated down to Pyongyang, which I think is really interesting. So like, I might have been scanning Kim Jong-un's MacBook, maybe not, but it's fun to think that it was. There's also like tons and tons of Cisco gear. So like, there's trade sanctions, right? So like, Cisco can't sell them stuff. So what they're doing is they buy Cisco gear on the black market, obviously, right? And there's lots of it. Like 90% of what I'm seeing is Cisco stuff. And like pretty normal Cisco stuff with pretty normal ports. On the Cisco stuff, they have port 22 and again, port 1984 for SSH. A lot of it's just like pretty normal kind of port stuff you would see in any data center, right? Like nothing super special. There's also this, administrative regularity. So what's really interesting with this is that one key manages all those boxes, right? Sometimes, say, the key will manage every box that has an IP address that ends in 5. Sometimes it'll be every box that has an IP address that ends in 6. But one key might manage like 20 or 30 boxes. And what that says is that they have this like really, really, really normalized sysadmin structure. Where a person or group of people is responsible for managing a number of kind of externally facing appliances. But from here, things get real interesting, right? So that was like the super boring stuff. But the really interesting stuff happens when you start scanning that military range, right? That 77 range. So first, oh, that picture got all messed up. First, during November 20th, I started noticing something really weird. The 77 range was really, really quiet for the first like few months of scans. You weren't finding anything. There was like almost nothing open. All of a sudden in November, there was this like tension over an island that the North Koreans had shelled like 5 years earlier. And like South Korea sent boats out and there was like a naval standoff and all this stuff. And all of a sudden the 77 range lit up like a Christmas tree. Like this is the satellite range. It lit up like a Christmas tree and had all kinds of weird ports. So they were starting to get results that looked like this. And it just keeps going. And that's one box. Just tons and tons and tons of weird ports all over the place. So I started looking into this, right? And I'm like, what is this range? Like, what does this range do? I started doing a bunch of research, right? And figured out a number of things. So first, the domestic North Korean external intranet is managed from this district in Pyongyang, which is also the district where military communications, intelligence, all their espionage activities, everything run out of this like 5 or 6 square block area in Pyongyang, right? It's also where all of the malware infections that were traced back to an IP that I read about were traced back to IP ranges that were managed from this area of Pyongyang, which is also where the 77 range is managed. And also satellites, because satellites are awesome. So I started digging in a little more. I found a bunch of information about Intelsat. This is actually their offices outside of Washington, D.C. They're a company that's based in Luxembourg. They have a really huge office on International Drive in Northwest D.C. They operate like 52 satellites that orbit the planet constantly. And they're subcontracting with this Russian company to like serve this IP space, the North Korean government. The relationship with North Korea can be traced back all the way to 2012, where North Korea's domestic ISP, Star KP, which is government-owned, made a BGP announcement for a route that ran through Intelsat. So this has been going on now for about 4 years. Numerous attacks on South Korea have been traced back to this range, right? And in fact, every single attack I read about that was able to be traced back to an IP address was traced to this range without exception, which is really interesting. Connection was initially discussed as a backup for land-based connections. And if you read any of the research about the North Korean internet that had come out before this, that's what everyone was saying. They're like, oh, it's a backup connection, they're not really using it. And when I started the scans, that was true. But when military tensions started kicking up, this range lit up like a Christmas tree. And all the way up until today, it's still that way. So after the nuke tests, right, so everyone remembered when they blew up a nuke and claimed it was a hydrogen bomb, that whole thing. The test occurred on January 6th, right? So since that time, a lot of scans have been blocked, right? And for about 3 weeks, I got nothing. And there was nothing. And internet traffic from North Korea like dropped off the map. There was almost nothing that anyone was getting coming in, coming out. And to get any results really required kind of bouncing IP addresses really often and scanning ranges and stuff and like really jumping around. And I wasn't really getting many results. And this went on for a period of time. So after the test though, scan results kind of remained very partial and scans were often blocked for about 3 to 4 weeks. There was just essentially nothing coming in, coming out, right? But when the scans were able to get through again, the internet in North Korea had fundamentally changed, which was really interesting. I started using Masscan as opposed to NMAP because I figured out that their instant response time was somewhere around an hour. And so if I used Masscan, I could kind of sneak it in before instant response kicked on. But when I finally got results back, the domestic ranges outside of the 77 range were essentially dark. There was nothing there, right? There might have been like one appliance in each range facing the outside that was on. Everything else was off. But the 77 range was super, super active, right? So I started noticing the activity in the 77 range at the end of November. The 77 range went dark during the nuke tests, but then after that, it got super, super, super active. Around the same time, all these reports about attacks on South Korea started coming out. There were also these reports that were issued by threat intel companies about this botnet that North Korea was running, so on, so on, so on. They traced it back to some 77 addresses, and it started in late November, right? And so I started to see this pattern, right? There's definitely a pattern here, that this range is like constantly active now, while everything else is dark. That the timing of the increased activity on the 77 range, again, corresponds to all these things. However, there's also all these rumors about increased internal repression in North Korea, maybe potentially an internal coup, things like this, right? Which directly corresponds to this sort of activity. So what can you learn about North Korea? Like when you scan North Korea a lot and you start to correlate it with news that's coming out and these kinds of things, what are the things you can actually learn, right? So again, instant response time in North Korea is somewhere around an hour for scans, right? If you can sneak a scan in on an IP range in under an hour, you're generally pretty good. Now, NMAP, if you're running through a VPN and you're trying to do a scan on all 65,000 ports, you're not going to get through in under an hour, right? There's just too many IPs. But if you're using mass scanning, you're literally blasting as many packets as your home internet connection can take, you'll actually squeeze it in. And when I started doing that, it was really successful. So again, after the shift from NMAP to Masscan, I was able to get a lot more results and wasn't blocked as often, and again, could complete a scan in under an hour. There's also a really good amount of evidence that attacks and reconnaissance being launched from the north, and that this is happening over this range, right? But it's primarily indicated to be the case during periods of sort of increased tension, which, if anyone's been paying any attention to what's going on with North Korea recently, their military posture has gotten very aggressive over the last like 2 to 3 months, right? Circumstantial evidence points to the use of this like 77 range for military purposes. The range itself is the only range that is currently exhibiting really any activity, at the same time that there are increased reports being issued by human rights organizations of the inability to contact people within North Korea. This period also correlates to an increased attack activity being attributed to North Korea. North Korean network operations are really super highly regimented. So when they change their security posture, it changes on everything. Right? It's not just that they might like tweak a firewall here or something like that, but they literally will change everything at the same time. And this might have to do a lot with the really highly regularized sysadmin structure that they seem to have. That the internet in North Korea is increasingly being devoted to military activity, at least the externally facing internet, at a time in which their military posture is increased in aggressiveness, and in which there are increasing reports of internal repression, especially within the inner circles of the Kim family itself. Right? There's all these reports about uncles being executed, things like this, right? That traditionally the North Korean ruling class was able to have access to the external internet, but it would have been through these domestic ranges, which are now almost completely dark, right? So if you're carrying out a purge internally, the one thing that you really don't want people doing is like emailing Japanese intelligence and being like, yo, you guys gonna send a boat to pick me up because I'm like, things are getting kind of hairy here. And they're very clearly cutting off contact from the ruling class that usually does have access to the external internet. So next steps. If anyone wants to have fun with North Korean instant response, you can download that script. It's Python, it's real simple, it's mostly making OS system calls. But it'll take your results and dump them in XML. With NMAP, it'll drop them in HTML. If anyone wants to look at the offensive security Masscan like web display GUI, it's really, really awesome, and that's what I use to usually visualize Masscan results. So the setup is like relatively simple, and you can take the XML results from Masscan and just stick them right in to your like web root and run a simple Apache server, and they'll display really nicely for you. I'm probably going to start using DNMAP to distribute and load balance all the scans for faster scanning. And the reason is that, how many people here have ever used Masscan? I mean, the results are okay, right? Like, they're not great. Like, I love NMAP results. They give you a lot more information. Right? Masscan results are really good for like figuring out what ports are open on what IPs. But they're not really going to tell you a lot about, you know, SSL certs, those kinds of things, right? But the problem with NMAP is that it's just too slow. So if you distribute all of these scans out, say over 40 VPSs, I might be able to speed them up fast enough to actually squeeze them in below instant response time and still use NMAP, which would be ideal. I might also start a public scanning repo. So if anyone's actually interested in scanning North Korea, which has a weird sort of mischievous fun to it, go for it and let me know. And I might be able to like set something up on like GitHub or something to kind of pull results in so people can find them. So thank you for coming. This is an email address. People can get in touch with me. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
How can you tell that the scan results, when you're getting blocked,
yeah.
their own ISP or the Chinese ISP or the Russian ISP blocking you, rather than the Korean government?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can't. What I can know, though, is that right before they start getting cut, you start getting a lot more fragmented packets coming back on NMAP, right? So if you're running in like super verbose mode, your results start coming back real slow and really partially, and then they would just cut, right? And it happened the same way every time, which is interesting. So the guess is, and again, this is coming from like outside reading and things like this, from other people that have scanned North Korea, that was a relatively common response regardless of where you were geographically when you were scanning. People saw that same kind of pattern. Right, so like when South Koreans were scanning the north, they saw the same thing. There were like some Japanese hackers that were doing it, they saw the same thing.
What about their allies, the Chinese or the Russians? Are they whitelisted? Are they
I don't know. I mean, there's no, the documentation on scanning North Korea is like pretty minimal. Right. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have no idea, right? That'd be an interesting experiment. If you know anyone in Russia that's interested in scanning North Korea, like. I mean, you could test that by like setting up a VPN that runs out of Russia, like on a Russian VPS provider, and trying to scan from there and seeing what happens.
So
Yeah, yeah.
Have you thought that maybe those hosts that all end in 5 are the same host, and it's just a game that they're playing with math to make it look like they're bigger addresses than they are?
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely something that went through my mind. I thought about, this is why I was using a differential analysis approach rather than trying to look at individual hosts because of that, right? So it's really about looking at the differences between results rather than individual hosts because, I mean, hell, they could have honeyports open on a bunch of stuff, right, whatever. So it's more about pattern analysis because of the level of deception that could be involved, right? We got to cut? Okay. All right, thank you, everyone.